The night was humid and thick, the kind of August air that clung to everything, to shirt collars, to windshields, to the skin of a man sitting quietly in the back of a rideshare sedan moving through the industrial edge of Memphis, Tennessee. The car was a black Lincoln, clean and unremarkable. The man inside was equally unremarkable, or so it seemed. He wore dark slacks, a pale blue dress, shirt rolled to the elbows, no tie. A leather briefcase rested against his knee. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, lean, with the kind of face that had spent decades listening to things that were never repeated in polite company. He did not look at his phone. He looked out the window at the passing warehouses and the broken streetlights and the graffiti-covered walls that had never quite healed from the last decade's neglect. His name, for the purposes of the evening, was Thomas Mercer. He had given the driver that name. It was technically correct. Thomas Mercer was one of his legal names. But it was the quieter of his names, the one used when he wanted to move without notice. He had 2 meetings the next morning, both in federal buildings, both under seal, both connected to an ongoing internal corruption investigation that had already produced 4 arrests in the Memphis field office and was about to produce 3 more. He had flown in alone. No security detail. That was deliberate. When you were investigating your own people, you did not bring your own people. The driver, a young man named Ellis who had a small American flag decal on his dashboard and a Bluetooth speaker playing soft R&B, turned left onto Clement Avenue. 2 blocks ahead, the lights of a police cruiser strobed red and blue in the wet air. "Traffic stop," Ellis murmured, slowing. "Just pull up normally," Thomas said. His voice was even, unremarkable. Ellis did. He brought the Lincoln to a slow roll and stopped behind a police unit parked diagonally across the right lane. A second unit sat facing them from the shoulder, its headlights on full. In the cone of white light, a figure in a Memphis PD uniform walked toward the Lincoln with the kind of walk that was not about traffic enforcement. It was a walk designed to project dominance. Shoulders wide, chin up, hand already resting on the belt near the holster, though it had not reached the weapon yet. The officer stopped at the driver's side window. He was large, not fat, but built like someone who had played offensive line in college and never entirely abandoned that sense of physical authority. His name tag read Kowalski. His badge was polished to a mirror shine. He wore his cap low, so his eyes were half-shaded when he bent to the window. "License and registration," he said, not to Ellis, but looking past Ellis at Thomas in the back seat. Ellis started to respond. "Officer, I'm a rideshare driver. I haven't done anything. I wasn't talking to you." Kowalski's finger tapped the door frame once. "I said license and registration, and I'm going to need the passenger to step out." Ellis froze. Thomas did not freeze. He reached calmly into his briefcase, retrieved his wallet, and said, "May I ask the reason for the stop?" Kowalski's jaw moved. A small, contemptuous shift. "Step out of the vehicle." "I'll be happy to cooperate," Thomas said. "I'm simply asking for the legal basis for the stop and the instruction to exit." The second officer had appeared at the passenger side window now. His name tag read DeLuca. He was younger, mid-30s, with a shaved head and a thin mustache that seemed to be working very hard to make him look more authoritative than he was. He knocked on the glass with 2 knuckles. "Out," DeLuca said. "Now." Thomas looked at Ellis briefly, a look that communicated nothing alarming, only calm, and opened the door. He stepped out onto the wet asphalt, briefcase in hand, and stood upright. He was not a small man. He stood just over 6 feet. But between the 2 officers and the glare of 4 headlights, he was deliberately positioned in the kind of confrontational geometry that had nothing to do with routine procedure. "Put the case down," Kowalski said. Thomas set the briefcase on the trunk of the Lincoln. He did not move aggressively. He moved the way a man moves who has stood in rooms where things of consequence were decided, deliberately, without wasted motion. "Hands on the car." "I'd like to understand what I'm being detained for," Thomas said. DeLuca stepped around the rear of the Lincoln. He was close now, within arm's reach. "We had a report of a suspicious individual matching your description in this area. Dark clothing, older male, possible narcotics connection. We're conducting a field check." Thomas let a moment pass. 1 full second of silence that somehow felt longer. "A field check," he repeated. "You want to keep arguing, or you want this to go smoothly?" Kowalski said, "Because I'm about 2 seconds away from putting you on the ground instead of asking you to put your hands on the car." Ellis, still in the driver's seat, had gone very still. His phone, resting in the cup holder, had been silently recording for the last 45 seconds. Thomas placed his hands on the trunk of the Lincoln. Kowalski moved behind him. Not quickly, not with urgency, but with the casual confidence of someone who had done this many times and had never once been wrong about who held the power in that moment. He ran his hands down Thomas's sides, patted his jacket, found nothing. "Open the case," DeLuca said. "That case contains federal documents," Thomas said, his voice still even, still unremarkable. DeLuca laughed. It was not a warm laugh. "Federal documents. Okay, buddy." He stepped forward and unlatched the briefcase himself. He opened it. Inside were 3 manila envelopes, a yellow legal pad with dense handwritten notes, a slim black phone, and a laminated card in a leather holder tucked against the inner flap. DeLuca reached for the laminated card. Thomas did not stop him. He watched. DeLuca looked at the card. He looked at it for 2 full seconds. Then he put it back, closed the briefcase, and stepped away from the trunk. He looked at Kowalski. Something had shifted in his expression, but only slightly. "Not enough. Not yet." "Cuff him," Kowalski said. "Kowalski, we don't know if those documents are real. He's being detained pending verification." Kowalski pulled zip ties from his belt, not handcuffs, which was itself a procedural irregularity, and moved behind Thomas. "Hands behind your back," Thomas said quietly. "Officer, I strongly advise you to reconsider what you're about to do." "Last warning," Kowalski said, and then the zip tie clicked. Ellis made a sound from inside the car. A sharp, involuntary intake of breath. His phone was still recording. Kowalski took Thomas by the upper arm and walked him toward the police cruiser. DeLuca followed, the briefcase in his hand. Thomas walked without resistance. He did not struggle. He did not raise his voice. He walked with the measured, unhurried patience of a man who was calculating precisely how long this would take and precisely what would happen at the end of it. Inside the cruiser, Kowalski left him in the back seat with the door closed and the engine running. He walked to the shoulder of the road where DeLuca was waiting. The card said, DeLuca began. "I saw what it said," Kowalski cut him off. "Those things get faked all the time. Dealers flash credentials. Politicians flash credentials. You know what I do? I verify. That's procedure." The card had a seal on it. An embossed seal. "DeLuca." Kowalski looked at him the way a man looks at someone whose hesitation is an inconvenience. "Embossed seals get faked. We detain him, we run his name, and if it comes back clean, we cut him loose and we apologize. Simple as that. This is a high narcotics corridor. We got a call. We responded. That's all." What Kowalski did not say, and what DeLuca already suspected, was that the call had not come through the normal dispatch line. It had come through Kowalski's personal phone at 9:47 p.m. from a number DeLuca had seen Kowalski take calls from before, a number connected to a man named Victor Prentice, who operated 4 warehouses on the south end of Clement Avenue, and who had an arrangement with at least 3 officers of the Memphis Police Department's night patrol rotation. An arrangement that kept those warehouses uninspected and unreported and very, very profitable. DeLuca had known about this arrangement for 11 months. He had not reported it. That was his own crime, smaller but no less real. And now he was standing in the middle of a humid Memphis night, holding the briefcase of a man whose credentials he had seen and partially understood and definitely feared, and Kowalski was telling him to stand still and let it play out. Inside the cruiser, Thomas Mercer looked straight ahead through the wire mesh that separated the back seat from the front. He was not panicking. He was not angry, not visibly. He was observing. The smell of the car, coffee, synthetic fabric, industrial cleaner, and something underneath that was wrong in a way he had smelled in enough precincts across enough states to identify, without effort, the smell of corruption. Not metaphorical corruption. Actual, procedural corruption. The kind that lived in the gaps between shifts, in the mutual silence of men who had decided that the rules applied to other people. He looked at the door handle. No interior handle. Standard issue for a cruiser back seat. He looked at the wire mesh partition. Standard issue. He looked at the mounted camera on the dashboard, its small red recording light blinking steadily. He looked at his wrists, zip-tied behind him, and he rotated his shoulders slightly, testing the tightness. Not painful. Manageable. Then he looked at the officers through the windshield. Kowalski was on his phone. DeLuca was standing apart from him, arms crossed, looking at the ground. Thomas Mercer, whose full legal name was Thomas Mercer Hale, who held the position of Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, appointed by the President of the United States, confirmed by the Senate by a vote of 71 to 28, cleared to above top secret levels across 14 active federal investigations, whose face had appeared on the front page of the Washington Post 4 times in the last 3 years, watched 2 men decide his fate on the side of a road in Memphis, Tennessee, and said nothing. He had a phone in his briefcase. He had a phone in his pocket. He could have made a call. He could have made one call, and within 3 minutes there would have been federal vehicles on Clement Avenue, and within 7 minutes those 2 officers would have understood the precise nature of their error. He did not make that call. Not yet. He was watching to see how far they would go. Outside, Kowalski finished his phone call and walked back to the cruiser. He opened the front door and sat in the driver's seat. He did not turn around. He pulled up a laptop mounted to the dash and began typing. "Name," he said. "Thomas Mercer Hale," Thomas said. Kowalski typed. The system took 11 seconds to return results. Thomas counted them. He had spent a great deal of his career understanding what 11 seconds meant in various contexts. Kowalski stared at the screen. His posture changed, not dramatically, not with the theatrics of a movie moment, but in the specific, subtle way that the human body changes when the mind receives information it did not expect and does not welcome. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. His neck stiffened. His right hand, resting on the keyboard, went still. He looked at the screen for a long time. Then he typed something else. Thomas watched the back of his head. Kowalski typed a 3rd time. "Slower now. Is there a problem?" Thomas asked. Kowalski said nothing. He got out of the car and walked quickly to DeLuca. He turned his back to the cruiser. Thomas could see their faces in the side mirror. DeLuca's expression had gone from cautious to something that was the first cousin of fear. He was speaking, pointing at the briefcase, pointing at the car. Kowalski shook his head. Once. Then again. DeLuca's voice rose. Thomas could not hear the words through the closed windows, but the body language was legible. DeLuca was not agreeing with Kowalski anymore. DeLuca was trying to reverse something that was already in motion. Kowalski pointed at him. A hard, sharp point. Index finger extended like a weapon. DeLuca went quiet. Kowalski walked back to the cruiser. He opened the rear door. "Mr. Hale," he said, and the shift in address, from nothing to a name, was its own kind of confession. "I'm going to need you to sit tight for a few more minutes while we sort out a discrepancy in our system." "What discrepancy?" Thomas asked. Kowalski did not answer. He closed the door. Thomas counted the seconds again. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, a black Chevy Tahoe pulled up behind the cruiser. Its windows were tinted. It had no markings. It sat for a moment. Then a man got out of the passenger's side, tall, wide-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket despite the heat, and walked toward Kowalski with the kind of authority that was different from Kowalski's authority. Kowalski's authority was issued. This man's was intrinsic. His name was Special Agent in Charge Raymond Dockery of the Memphis FBI Field Office. He had received a soft alert notification on a secure monitoring app at 10:14 p.m. The notification was triggered automatically when Director Hale's credential card was scanned, which DeLuca had inadvertently done when he picked up the card from the briefcase, and the RFID chip embedded in the leather holder had registered contact. It was a passive security protocol. The director had not activated it intentionally. His team had installed it years ago for exactly this kind of situation. Dockery did not run. He walked. But there was no wasted motion in his walk. He reached Kowalski and said something that Thomas could not hear. Kowalski responded. Dockery held out a hand, palm up. Kowalski looked at the hand, then looked away. Dockery said something else. Shorter this time. Kowalski's jaw moved. Then he reached into his pocket and placed his phone in Dockery's open palm. Dockery walked to the cruiser, opened the rear door, and looked in at Thomas with an expression that was professional but was carrying something personal underneath it. The specific discomfort of a man who has discovered that something terrible has happened within arm's reach of his jurisdiction. Sir, Dockery said. Are you injured? No, Thomas said. I need to remove the restraints. Yes, you do. Dockery reached in with a small tool and cut the zip tie. Thomas brought his arms forward, rolled his shoulders once, and looked at Dockery with a gaze that had been described in various after-action reports written by people who had been on the receiving end of it as the organizational equivalent of a targeting system acquiring a lock. "Get me out of this car," Thomas said. He stepped onto the asphalt. DeLuca was standing 20 feet away, and when Thomas turned toward him, DeLuca made an involuntary step backward. It was small, but it was there. Thomas straightened his shirt. He looked at Kowalski, who was standing still with his arms at his sides, and whose face had taken on the gray, blank quality of a man whose brain has not yet fully accepted what his body already knows, that the next several minutes were going to change the rest of his life. Thomas picked up his briefcase from the hood of the cruiser where Kowalski had placed it. He opened it, checked the contents, and closed it. He looked at DeLuca. "Was it you who examined the credential?" Thomas asked. DeLuca's throat moved. "Yes, sir." "Did you communicate what you saw to Officer Kowalski?" Another pause. "I did." "And what was his response?" DeLuca looked at Kowalski. Kowalski looked at DeLuca. Between them, in that look, was the weight of 11 months of complicity and the sudden, crystalline understanding that the mathematics of self-preservation had just changed completely. "He told me to proceed with the detention," DeLuca said. Kowalski made a sound. A short, hard exhale. "You don't," Dockery said. One word. Flat and final. Kowalski went silent. Thomas took out his personal phone and made a single call. It rang once. It was answered immediately. He spoke for 45 seconds. He gave 3 names, 2 addresses, 1 warehouse reference number, and said the words, "Activate the secondary warrant package." Then he ended the call and put the phone in his pocket. He looked at Kowalski for a long moment. Not with heat, not with revenge, with the quiet, settled certainty of someone who has already decided what happens next and knows with absolute confidence that it will happen. "Officer Kowalski," Thomas said, "you've had a significant night." Kowalski said nothing. "The call you took at 9:47, Thomas continued. "The one that originated this stop. I want you to think about that call for the next few minutes, because in approximately 15 minutes, the individuals associated with that call will be in federal custody, their phones will be seized, and their call logs will be extracted. And when that extraction is processed, which will happen tonight, not in a week, not after appeals, tonight, your number will appear on those logs, and the logs will appear in a federal record, and that record will not go away." Kowalski's face had gone from gray to something closer to white. "You had an opportunity to correct this 3 times, Thomas said. When Officer DeLuca attempted to tell you what he had seen, when the database returned my file, and when Agent Dockery arrived, you made the same choice. 3 times. He paused. "People should not be given 4 chances." He walked to the Tahoe. Ellis, the rideshare driver, was still in the Lincoln, his phone no longer recording but still in his hand, his expression that of a man who has witnessed something he cannot yet process. Thomas stopped at the Lincoln's window. "Ellis," he said. Ellis looked up. "What happened tonight was not your fault. You're going to be contacted by federal agents within 24 hours. Tell them everything you saw and heard, including what was recorded on your phone. Don't delete it. Don't share it. Just tell the truth." He reached into his briefcase, took out a card, and handed it through the window. "If anyone tells you not to cooperate, or if anyone contacts you in a way that makes you uncomfortable, call that number immediately. It will be answered." Ellis looked at the card. He looked at Thomas. He said, "Yes, sir." Thomas got into the Tahoe. Within 12 minutes of the Tahoe pulling away from Clement Avenue, 3 things happened in rapid sequence. First, federal warrants, which had been sealed and ready for execution for 9 days, pending the director's final authorization, which he had just given by phone, were activated simultaneously across 5 locations in Memphis, including 2 of Victor Prentice's warehouses, a property management office on the south side, and the private residence of a senior Memphis police lieutenant named Harold Vance, who had been identified as the organizational anchor of the corruption network. Second, 6 FBI agents and 4 agents from the DEA's Memphis Task Force moved on those locations under coordinated entry protocols, and within 40 minutes of the first door being breached, Victor Prentice was face down on the floor of his warehouse office with his hands cuffed behind him, while an agent read him his rights in a voice that was steady and entirely without drama. Third, Special Agent in Charge Dockery called the Memphis Police Department's Chief of Police, a woman named Claudette Marsh, at 10:49 p.m. and told her to come downtown immediately. He did not explain why over the phone. She came. What she found when she arrived at the federal building on North Main Street was a situation that had already moved past the stage where explanations were useful and had entered the stage where documentation and damage control were the only remaining currencies. Dockery briefed her in a conference room on the 4th floor. He was methodical, unemotional, and comprehensive. He told her about the stop on Clement Avenue. He told her about the zip ties. He told her about the credential, the database return, and the sequence of decisions made by officers Kowalski and DeLuca. He showed her the dashboard camera footage from Kowalski's cruiser, which had been transmitted to the field office within the last hour. He showed her the RFID alert log from the director's credential holder. He showed her the call record extracted from Kowalski's phone, already obtained under emergency warrant, showing the 9:47 p.m. call from a number registered to a disposable phone purchased in Victor Prentice's name. Chief Marsh watched all of this without speaking. She was a 26-year veteran of law enforcement, the first black female chief of the Memphis Police Department, a woman who had spent a significant portion of her career trying to professionalize and reform a force that had long resisted both. She sat with her hands flat on the table and watched the footage of 2 of her officers zip-tying the director of the FBI on the side of a road in her city, and the expression on her face was not one of embarrassment. It was one of grief, and then hardness, and then resolution, in that order. "Where are they now?" she asked. "Kowalski is in a holding room downstairs. DeLuca is in a separate room. They've been advised of their rights. Neither has requested an attorney yet, which I find notable. What's the director's position?" Dockery paused. "Director Hale is upstairs. He has been conducting his scheduled meetings since 11:15 p.m. Marsh looked at him. "He rescheduled them to tonight," Dockery said. "Said he didn't see a reason to delay." Marsh stood up. She straightened her jacket. She was a woman who had navigated a great many rooms where people expected her to be smaller than she was, and she had long since stopped adjusting for those expectations. "I want to make a statement to my officers about what happened tonight before this breaks publicly. How long do I have?" "The story will be on 3 news platforms by morning regardless." Someone at the scene took a photograph. "It's being authenticated, but it's real. You have perhaps 4 hours before the full story is coherent and public. I need 40 minutes. You have it." She walked out and made the call she needed to make. Kowalski and DeLuca were suspended without pay by formal departmental notice at 12:30 a.m. The notice was countersigned by the city's Police Oversight Board chair, who had been reached at home and who had agreed without hesitation. By 2 a.m., a departmental internal affairs investigation had been formally opened, separate from and subordinate to the federal investigation, and a prosecutor from the Shelby County District Attorney's Office had been assigned as a civilian oversight contact. Downstairs, Kowalski sat in a federal holding room that was clean, quiet, and devoid of anything useful to him. He had asked for water. He had received it. He had not asked for a lawyer. He sat with his forearms on the metal table and stared at the surface and thought about things that were not yet fully real to him, because the mind has a lag when the world changes faster than it can adapt. He had been a cop for 19 years. He had joined because it was the family trade. His father had been on the force, his uncle, his older brother who had retired on a shoulder injury at 44. He had not been, in the beginning, corrupt. The beginning had been normal enough, as these things go. The cynicism that grew from the gap between what the job was supposed to be and what it actually was, the bitterness that accumulated from courts that dismissed cases and supervisors who looked away and politicians who asked for impossible things and blamed cops when they delivered the wrong impossible things. And then someone had introduced him to Victor Prentice 4 years ago at a retirement party, and Prentice had been warm and generous and had talked about the warehouses as a business opportunity, and the first payment had felt like a bonus, and the second had felt like an arrangement, and by the 6th it had simply felt like the way things worked. He was thinking about this now, not with regret in its full form, but with the particular brand of cold clarity that comes when the consequences are no longer theoretical. He was thinking about his pension. He was thinking about his daughter, who was 14 and who had come to her school's career day 2 years ago in a little version of his uniform and beamed while he told her classmates about serving the community. He was thinking about the specific way that the director of the FBI had looked at him, not with anger, not with contempt, but with something much worse, a kind of settled, total, unhurried certainty, as if Kowalski's outcome had already been calculated and filed and required no further emotional investment. The door opened. A federal attorney sat down across from him. She introduced herself. She placed a folder on the table. Mr. Kowalski, she said, tonight you unlawfully detained and restrained the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation without cause, without legal basis, and in knowing possession of information that made his identity clear to your partner and accessible to you via departmental database. You did this in connection with an individual, Victor Prentice, who is currently in federal custody and whose phone records place him in direct communication with you at the time of the stop. She opened the folder. I'm going to tell you what you're looking at, and then I'm going to tell you what your options are, and then you're going to make a decision. She told him. The charges, as enumerated, included deprivation of civil rights under color of law, obstruction of a federal officer, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and, based on the connection to Prentice and the warehouse operations, conspiracy to facilitate drug distribution. The sentencing range, at the top end, was not abstract. Kowalski listened. He did not speak. When she finished, he asked for a lawyer. In the adjacent room, DeLuca had already asked for a lawyer 40 minutes earlier and had then, 10 minutes after that, fired the lawyer he hadn't even met yet and said he wanted to make a proffer. The attorney brought in to handle the proffer was from the DOJ's Public Integrity Section. She arrived at 1:15 a.m. in a suit that suggested she had been awake and dressed when she got the call. DeLuca told her everything. He told her about the 11 months. He told her about the 3 other officers he knew were on Prentice's payroll. He told her about Lieutenant Vance, who had already been arrested at his residence, but against whom the evidence had been largely circumstantial until DeLuca began speaking. He told her about a 4th warehouse that was not yet in the warrant package and about a financial arrangement that ran through a shell company in Nashville. He spoke for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and when he finished, his voice was tired but his posture had changed. He was sitting straighter, not with pride, with the particular exhausted relief of someone who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has finally, irrevocably, put it down. The morning broke gray and warm over Memphis. By 6 a.m., the story had broken on 4 national outlets and 17 local ones. The photograph that had been authenticated, taken by a passing motorist on Clement Avenue, showed 2 uniformed officers standing over a man with his hands zip-tied behind his back beside a black Lincoln sedan. The man's face was turned slightly away. His posture was upright, unhurried, dignified. The caption on the first outlet to run it was, "Photo appears to show FBI director detained by Memphis police. Federal investigation underway." By 8 a.m., it was the lead story on every major news network. The White House press secretary confirmed that the director had been temporarily detained, was uninjured, and had continued his work schedule without interruption. The confirmation was brief and measured, but the phrase "continued his work schedule without interruption" was chosen with precision because it was both accurate and devastating, because it made clear that whatever those 2 officers had believed they were doing on Clement Avenue, they had not succeeded in doing it. They had succeeded only in making their own situation irreversible. The footage from Kowalski's dashboard camera was released by federal order at 10 a.m. It ran on every platform simultaneously. It was 7 minutes and 22 seconds long. It showed the stop, the instruction to exit the vehicle, the zip tying, and the walk to the cruiser. It showed DeLuca opening the briefcase and holding the credential. It showed DeLuca walking to Kowalski. It showed the subsequent conversation from a distance, without audio, but the body language told the story with sufficient clarity. And it showed Thomas Mercer Hale, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, sitting in the back of a Memphis police cruiser in zip ties for 14 minutes before Agent Dockery arrived. The footage was watched 42 million times in the first 18 hours. In Memphis, Claudette Marsh held a press conference at 9 a.m. She stood at the podium in full uniform, her face composed but not insulated from the weight of what she was saying. She did not use the language of damage control. She used the language of accountability, which is a different thing entirely, and experienced reporters in the room noted the distinction. What occurred on Clement Avenue last night was a violation of law, a violation of the rights of a federal officer, and an example of the corruption that I have spent years attempting to eradicate from this department, she said. 2 officers are suspended pending criminal prosecution. 3 additional officers are under investigation for separate but related conduct. An internal affairs review of the entire Night Patrol Division is being initiated immediately. I will not defend last night. I will not explain it away. I will prosecute it. She took 3 questions and left the podium. She did not take questions about the FBI director personally. She took questions about the systemic investigation. Victor Prentice was arraigned at 2 p.m. He appeared in federal court in a tan jumpsuit, his hair unset, his face carrying the specific desolation of a man who has spent years operating in the shadows and has woken up in the light. His attorney requested bail. The prosecutor enumerated the charges: racketeering, drug distribution conspiracy, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy to obstruct justice, specifically noting the phone call to Officer Kowalski that had initiated the stop on Clement Avenue. Bail was denied. The presiding judge, a woman in her 60s named Eleanor Rathmore, who had sat on the federal bench for 22 years and had heard a great many extraordinary things without visible reaction, listened to the recitation of charges and said only, "Remanded," in a voice that required no amplification. Lieutenant Harold Vance, whose arrest at his residence had been executed at 11:40 p.m. the previous night, was charged separately with conspiracy and bribery. His attorney was at the arraignment. Vance was a man of 61 who had been with the Memphis PD for 33 years and who had a commendation wall in his home office that covered most of one wall, and who had, 11 years ago, been cited for valor in a situation that had genuinely required valor, and who had, at some point in the years after that, decided that the commendation and the bribery could exist in the same person without contradiction. Courts had a standard view of that particular belief. The three other officers identified by DeLuca's proffer were arrested over the following 22 hours. Each arrest was quiet, coordinated, and complete. Each one generated local and national coverage. By the end of the second day, the phrase Memphis Police Corruption Network had become a standard term in news coverage, attached now to 5 officers, 1 lieutenant, 2 civilian contractors, and Victor Prentice. On the third day after the stop on Clement Avenue, Director Hale appeared before a closed session of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The session was not public, but its subject was known: the ongoing investigation into the Memphis field office, the events of the night, and the broader question of how an active law enforcement corruption network had operated for years within close proximity to a federal field office without triggering adequate response. He testified for 3 hours. He was precise, thorough, and direct. He named the failures in the institutional chain that had allowed the situation to persist. He recommended specific structural changes to field office oversight protocols. He did not speak about the events on Clement Avenue in personal terms. He spoke about them as an institutional data point. After the session, a senator from Ohio, older, silver-haired, a former federal judge, stopped him in the corridor outside the hearing room. "Tom," the senator said. "How are you?" "Fine," Thomas said. "You should have called. The moment they put hands on you, you should have called." Thomas looked at him. "I was watching to see how far they would go." The senator was quiet for a moment. "And far enough," Thomas said. "Exactly far enough." The trial of Officer Kowalski began 4 months later in federal court in Memphis. It lasted 11 days. The prosecution was led by a DOJ public integrity attorney who had handled 17 corruption cases in a career that had produced 16 convictions. She presented the dashboard footage, the RFID credential log, the phone records, DeLuca's testimony, the database return showing exactly when and how completely Kowalski's system had identified the detainee, and the testimony of 3 additional witnesses, including Ellis, the rideshare driver, who sat in the witness stand in a clean button-down shirt and described what he had seen with the quiet, certain precision of a man who had thought about it many times and had concluded that the truth was the only thing worth saying. The defense argued that the stop was procedurally valid, that the credential verification was inconclusive in the field, and that the subsequent detention was a reasonable response to an ambiguous situation. It was an argument that might have functioned in a different courtroom with a different set of facts. It did not function in this one. On the 9th day of trial, the prosecution called its final witness. Thomas Mercer Hale walked into the courtroom with the same unhurried precision with which he walked into every room. He was dressed in a dark suit. He sat in the witness chair, adjusted the microphone, and placed his hands on the rail in front of him. The prosecutor asked him to describe the events of the night of August 14th, and he did so in the same methodical, cinematic detail that characterized every account he gave of anything. He described the car. He described the stop. He described the instructions. He described the zip ties. He He described sitting in the back of the cruiser for 14 minutes. He described it all without elevation or embellishment, without visible anger, and without softening a single element. When the defense attorney cross-examined him, the first question was, "Director Hale, is it possible that in the dark, on a poorly lit road, an officer might have difficulty immediately verifying your identity?" Thomas looked at the attorney with the calm, level attention of someone who has been asked questions by people attempting to build something out of nothing and who understands the architecture being attempted. "Officer Kowalski ran my name through the departmental database while I was in his vehicle," Thomas said. "The return took 11 seconds. The return included my full name, title, federal appointment, and a photograph. He then asked me additional questions, during which time he had full use of his radio and could have contacted federal contacts through 3 separate available channels. At no point after that 11-second return was there any ambiguity." The defense attorney paused. "But you could have identified yourself more directly at the outset." "I provided my name when asked," Thomas said. "I informed Officer DeLuca that my briefcase contained federal documents before he opened it. I advised Officer Kowalski to reconsider his course of action at the moment the zip tie was applied. Each of those communications was a sufficient identification event. The question of whether I identified myself adequately is a different question from the question of whether Officer Kowalski used the information available to him. The latter is what is at issue." The defense attorney sat down. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 40 minutes. They returned on a Thursday afternoon with verdicts on all counts. "Guilty, guilty, guilty, guilty." The word, said 4 times in the same flat, judicial voice by the jury foreperson, a woman in her 40s who ran a small shipping business in South Memphis and who had listened to 11 days of testimony with the concentrated attention of someone who understood that what happened in courtrooms was not separate from what happened in the streets outside them, landed in the courtroom with the specific weight of things that cannot be undone. Kowalski did not make a sound when the verdicts were read. He sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at a point on the wall above the jury box and breathed. His attorney put a hand on his arm. He did not move. Sentencing was held 6 weeks later. The judge, federal, named Harrison, had a reputation for thoughtful, proportionate sentencing that was nonetheless absolute on matters of public corruption. He spoke for 12 minutes before announcing the sentence. He spoke about the role of law enforcement in a constitutional democracy. He spoke about the specific harm caused when those entrusted with authority use it as a personal instrument. He spoke about the compounding nature of the harm, not just the act itself, but the message it sent, the fear it generated, the erosion of institutional trust that was difficult to rebuild and impossible to rush. Then he sentenced Officer Alan Kowalski to 9 years in federal prison, 5 years of supervised release upon completion, permanent revocation of law enforcement credentials in all jurisdictions, and forfeiture of all retirement benefits associated with the Memphis Police Department. The courtroom was quiet when he finished. Lieutenant Vance received 11 years. Victor Prentice received 22, enhanced by the federal racketeering statute and by a prior federal charge that had been resolved with a plea in 2018 and which now served as the predicate for the enhancement. The 3 additional officers received sentences ranging from 3 to 6 years. DeLuca, in recognition of his proffer cooperation and his testimony across multiple trials, received 18 months in a federal minimum security facility and a formal agreement with the prosecutor's office that acknowledged his substantial assistance. He had not asked for leniency in the language of his proffer. He had simply told the truth and let the system respond to it. On the day of Kowalski's sentencing, a small thing happened that was not reported in the news. After the courtroom cleared, Ellis, the rideshare driver, sat in the gallery for a few minutes by himself. He was not sure exactly what he was doing there. He had given his testimony 10 days earlier, and it had gone simply and without incident, and he had driven back to his apartment and made himself dinner and gone to sleep. But that afternoon he had found himself getting in his car and driving to the federal building and parking and going inside and sitting in the gallery for the sentencing. And he had listened to the judge's words with the particular attention of a young man who is trying to understand something that his education had not specifically prepared him for. What he was trying to understand was this: whether the system worked. Not in an abstract sense. Not in the sense of a civics class or a campaign speech. In the actual, specific, verifiable sense of, did the thing that was supposed to happen, happen? And sitting in that gallery, he concluded that it had. Not perfectly. Not without cost. Without the 14 minutes in the back of a cruiser. Without 11 months of DeLuca's silence. Without the years of Prentice operating openly in a city where someone should have looked harder and sooner. It had not happened cleanly. But it had happened. He drove home. He called his mother. He told her he'd been in court. She asked what for. He said, witnessing. She asked if everything was okay. He said, yeah, Mom. I think it actually is. In Washington, in a building on Pennsylvania Avenue that did not require introduction, Thomas Mercer Hale sat at his desk at 7:40 in the evening, which was a normal time for him to be at his desk. The office was large, but not ostentatious. 2 windows faced south, and through them the last gray light of the evening was thinning into darkness. A floor lamp cast a warm circle across the desk. The room smelled of old paper and cold coffee, and the particular stillness of a space where consequential things had been decided for a long time. He was reading a briefing report on systemic reform recommendations submitted by a joint task force that had spent 90 days analyzing the Memphis field office and its relationship to local law enforcement coordination. The report was dense and precise and contained 37 recommendations, 19 of which he agreed with fully, 11 of which he intended to modify, and 7 of which he thought were structurally sound but operationally optimistic. He had annotations in the margins in blue ink. He would have his response drafted by the end of the week. His assistant, a young woman named Patricia who had been with the office for 3 years and who communicated almost entirely through controlled understatement, knocked twice and entered without waiting for a response, which was the established protocol after 6 p.m. Senator Greer's office called again, she said. He wants a statement for the record regarding the Memphis reform package. His communications director used the word urgent 4 times in one sentence. Thomas did not look up from the report. Tell them the statement will be submitted in writing by Friday, and that the word urgent is not a scheduling mechanism. Patricia made a note. Also, Chief Marsh is on the secure line. She says it's brief. He set down his pen and picked up the phone. Claudette Marsh's voice was even, as it always was, but beneath it there was something that had not been there in the months immediately following August 14th. Something that resembled, if not peace, then at least the absence of the particular pressure that came from carrying something that could not be put down. The final officer from the internal review cleared his appeals today, she said. He's out. Permanently. That's all 6. The department is clean on the night patrol roster. Good, Thomas said. I also wanted you to know that the Community Oversight Board had its first independent session this week. Full attendance. 3 community representatives who've never sat in a formal law enforcement review before. They asked the right questions. She paused. It's a beginning. Beginnings are sufficient, Thomas said. Keep going. He ended the call, set down the phone, and leaned back in his chair for a moment. Outside the windows, Washington had completed its transition from evening to night. The monuments were lit now, pale against the dark sky, fixed and deliberate and indifferent to the daily turbulence that moved around them. They had been lit the same way on nights when the city had done well and on nights when it had done badly, and they did not distinguish between the two. That was perhaps their function, not to celebrate or condemn, but simply to remain, to insist on continuity. On his desk, beside the briefing report, was a small framed photograph. It was not a personal photograph. It was a photograph of the Memphis courthouse taken on the day of the original indictments, published in a local paper, showing the front steps in the morning light with the doors open and people arriving for the first hearing. Ordinary people, some in suits, some not, climbing ordinary stone steps toward a door that led to a room where things would be decided according to rules that everyone inside had agreed, in one form or another, to believe in. It was a photograph of a building, unremarkable as buildings go, but he had asked Patricia to have it framed and placed on his desk 2 days after the sentencing, and he had not moved it since. It meant something to him that he did not fully articulate, not because the meaning was unclear, but because some meanings function better when they are not converted into language. It meant something about the difference between things that held and things that collapsed, about institutions, and whether they were worth the effort of maintaining them across the long, grinding, unglamorous span of decades, about whether the work of accountability was something a person could believe in not as an article of faith, but as a matter of observed, documented, irreversible evidence. He had sat in the back of a cruiser in Memphis in zip ties and watched two men decide that his identity and his authority and his rights were negotiable. He had said nothing and waited because he needed to know how far they would go and because the answer to that question was going to be used to build something. Not a prosecution alone, but a record, a reform package, a corrected set of procedures that would outlast the individuals involved on every side of what had happened. He had always known what he was building. He had simply needed the raw material. Victor Prentice was in a federal facility in Kentucky, working through the first year of 22. Lieutenant Vance was in a facility in Tennessee, where the irony of his geography was either lost on him or had become something he managed privately. Kowalski was in federal minimum security in Ohio, where he had reportedly joined a literacy tutoring program for other inmates. Thomas had read that in a case update file and had sat with it for a moment without judgment. People contain more than one thing. That was not exculpatory. It was simply true. DeLuca had completed his 18 months and was working as a logistics coordinator for a private shipping company in Nashville. He had given a single interview to a regional podcast about policing and accountability. He had not sought attention beyond it. He had said, near the end of the interview, that the hardest thing he had ever done was not testifying. The hardest thing was the 11 months before it. Ellis had been hired by a nonprofit legal aid organization in Memphis as a community liaison. He had never gone to law school. He had never worked in law enforcement. He had simply sat in a car on the right night, kept his phone recording, and told the truth when asked. Sometimes that was the entire shape of a person's contribution to justice, and it was not a small shape. Thomas looked at the photograph for a moment longer. Then he turned the page of the briefing report and continued reading. Outside, Washington moved through its night, traffic thinning on the avenues, monuments holding their light against the dark, the Potomac carrying whatever it carried, as it always had, without comment. A city of contradictions and carefully maintained fictions and, occasionally, hard-won, visible, irreversible moments of getting something exactly right. The kind of city that produced men like Kowalski and men like Hale in equal measure, and then waited, with no particular urgency, to see which one the system would protect. Tonight, the record was clear. The work continued. Thomas Mercer Hale walked down the corridor at 9:23 p.m. with the briefing report tucked under his arm and his footsteps making the particular sound that empty government hallways make at night. A sound that was not quite an echo, not quite a silence, but something in between, something that belonged specifically to buildings where the work never fully stopped even when the people inside them did. Patricia had already gone home. The night security officer at the end of the hall nodded once as Thomas passed. Thomas nodded back. That was the full extent of the exchange, and it was sufficient. There was a kind of dignity in small acknowledgments, in the quiet recognition between two people who were both, in their separate ways, still present when most others had left. He took the elevator down, stood in it alone, watched the numbers descend. In the lobby, he stopped at the front desk and signed out in the physical log, an old habit from his early field years that he had never abandoned, because he believed that the habit of accounting for oneself, even in small ways, was a discipline worth keeping regardless of rank, especially regardless of rank. Outside, the night air was cool and carried the faint smell of rain that had not yet arrived. His car was waiting at the curb. The driver, a quiet man named Gerald who had driven him for 6 years and who understood that silence was not unfriendliness, held the door without speaking. Thomas got in. The door closed. The city moved past the windows, lit and restless and unfinished, as it had always been, as it would always be. He did not look at his phone. He looked out the window, at the streets and the people still moving through them at this hour, at the lights of the buildings and the darkness between them, at a city that contained, simultaneously, everything that had gone wrong and everything that still might go right. He thought about Ellis, in Memphis, telling the truth on a witness stand in a clean button-down shirt. He thought about Marsh, rebuilding something from the inside out, one honest session at a time. He thought about DeLuca, who had carried a weight for 11 months and had finally, irrevocably, put it down. None of them had done extraordinary things. They had done ordinary things with extraordinary consistency, in moments when consistency was the only form of courage available. That was, in the end, how most things worth doing actually got done. not in a single dramatic gesture, but in the accumulation of small, deliberate choices made by ordinary people who had decided, quietly and without announcement, that the truth was worth the cost of saying it. The car turned onto the avenue. The rain began, soft at first, then steady, moving across the windshield in the way that rain moves when it has no urgency, when it is simply doing what it was always going to do. Thomas Mercer Hale watched it fall and said nothing, and was already thinking about tomorrow.